Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 6 on the Western Front, the British sector in the trenches. And the previous video we were looking at some of the illnesses that the soldiers had to put up with in the trenches. And if you remember, one of them that we looked at right towards the end, sometimes known as shell shock, or as the British Army later called it, NYDN, not yet diagnosed nervous. Now altogether there were over 80,000 recorded cases of shell shock, NYDN. Ask yourself, how many were actually unrecorded? So we can see therefore that obviously wounds and injuries and illnesses were a huge problem in the British sector on the Western Front. And this video we're going to concentrate on some of the other wounds and injuries that the soldiers had to endure in those 4 long years of conflict. Now here's a statistic. More than 2 million British soldiers were wounded throughout the course of the war. Now obviously their wounds and their injuries relate very closely to the weapons that were being used. World War I, 20th century, new technology was being used. It was a new type of war. Now let's have a look at the 4 main weapons. We've got machine guns, artillery, rifles and shrapnel. M-A-R-S, Mars. You could say maybe these weapons were out of this world. Or put it another way, artillery, rifle, machine gun, shrapnel, ARMS, arms. Arms is another word for weapons. Whichever one you can use to remind yourself, Mars, M-A-R-S, arms, A-R-M-S, you choose the one that works best for you. Let's have a look at these 4 types of weapons. Let's start with the rifle. Now obviously this was not new. The Lee Enfield 303 was a rifle that was used, but it was improved. You could now fire cartridges or bullets more rapidly. So the rifle was improving and getting technologically better. Next to the rifle, we have the machine gun. This was a very, very effective weapon, and unfortunately caused many thousands of casualties. The machine gun could fire round about 500 rounds per minute. It was a huge improvement. It was probably equal to about 100 rifles. Now, think of the tactic that was used. Many times in these big battles, early in the morning, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, the whistles would blow all the way down the trenches and soldiers would go over the top and march across no man's land, straight into withering fire from these machine guns. No wonder so many men were killed or wounded. So machine guns linked to the tactics meant that it was a very, very devastating weapon. Next to that we have the artillery. Now go back into history, into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. The armies used cannons. The artillery of World War I was an improvement on these cannons. Throughout the course of the war, over 170 million shells were fired on the Western Front. 58% of British soldiers' wounds, the casualties were caused by artillery or mortar shells. The artillery could fire far further at much increased range, 10, 12 miles. So therefore you get larger bombardments. Before the Battle of the Somme, July 1916, for the previous week, the British shelled the German trenches with more than 1 million shells. Now about 30% of them didn't explode. And also, if you remember, the Germans were safe in their very, very deep dugouts, so it didn't work. But artillery was a very, very powerful weapon. And the final one, S, shrapnel. Now here we have a shell, but it was hollow, and inside they packed in almost like lead balls or steel balls, sometimes like ball bearings. and they were fired on a timer, and they would explode in the air, and then all this metal would come down at a very, very high speed, the shrapnel, and it would lacerate and cut through the body. The British shell, the 18-pounder gun, the shell had 375 lead balls tightly packed within it. So, machine gun, artillery, rifle, shrapnel. They are the 4 key weapons. Now, what wounds, what injuries did these 4 weapons cause? That's the second part of this video, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's start with the rifle. Obviously, a rifle can kill, a bullet can kill, depends on where it hits in the body. And it also caused, if it didn't kill, it would wound by hitting the body and causing a gunshot wound. Rifle, very, very straightforward. Let's go to the machine gun. Now, obviously, it's very similar to the rifle, but at a greater pace and covering more men. So we've got cuts, bruises, broken bones, damaged organs. These are the key features of wounds from rifle and machine gun. Now, the trench, of course, did give some protection. That's why they dug the trenches. Look back to some of the other videos on that. But look at my hat here. Very nice hat too it is. But look at the material. You can see quite clearly. It is very, very soft. Look at that, I can bend it. That's not going to be very good protection if you are aimed at the head. A shot, bullets from either the rifle or the machine gun at your head. That's not very good. The Germans, if you remember, put that there, at the start of the war, they had the magnificent pickle house. Now, fantastic design that is, but this was a very old helmet as well, had been used through the 19th century. This was made from leather. As the war went on, the Germans realised that this wasn't a very effective helmet for the new technology, for the new weapons. So the Germans themselves, 1915, 1916, they stopped using the pickle house. And they started using called the Stahl helm, steel helmet. And it's more that sort of shape, made from steel. Okay, the Stahl helm. That's what the Germans did. But what about the British? Remember, all the officers wearing these soft caps? 1915, the British introduced the Brody helmet. There it is. Made from steel. And look at the shape, look at the design. So with the introduction of the Brody helmet, they are trying to give extra protection against gunshot wounds, whether by rifle or machine gun. Now, it still didn't work. There were still 60,000 casualties with head wounds, face wounds, eye wounds, but it did reduce the number of casualties. It did give extra protection, the Brody helmet, 1915. What about artillery? Now, artillery wounds, what could happen there? Well, they could, depending on how closely the shell exploded, it could remove a limb, it could remove an arm or a leg. It could cause major internal damage to the organs. These were very, very severe wounds. Often they killed. Sometimes they gave very, very severe wounds which weren't fatal, provided they could get them back through the chain of evacuation. Blood loss, concussion from the blast. Remember a statistic, 240,000 amputees in World War I. So the artillery wounds, again, were very, very deadly in some ways, but even if you survived, it's unlikely that you would be returning to health. Artillery, a key area. And the final one, S, shrapnel. Similar to artillery, maybe slightly more on the skin which is open to the air. Remember, it's tiny, tiny fragments of metal rushing through the air. Tiny cuts. difficult to find, damaged internally, of course, to the organs, blood loss, particularly internal blood loss. Now, with these sorts of injuries, both from artillery and shrapnel, and indeed from machine gun, maybe technology could help. Remember mobile X-ray units. It's far easier to do an X-ray and see where the metal is than go in with your mucky fingers. It was better, it was safer. So mobile X-ray units were helping deal with these wounds and these injuries. One American surgeon, Dr. Cushing, he did a lot particularly with head wounds, and he used the X-rays, the mobile X-rays, and he also used a magnet to try and attract these tiny fragments so that they could remove them from the body. So there are the wounds, there are the injuries linked very closely to the weapons. Now there's a couple more just to finish with. One weapon which was used not throughout World War I, it came in during World War I, was gas. 4 types of gas were used. 1914, tear gas. This would not kill, but it would disable the soldier. He wouldn't be able to see. So it disabled rather than killed. That's the first one, tear gas. 3 others were then introduced later during the war. 1915, chlorine, the first real killer gas that was used. April 1915, used first by the Germans, later then used by all armies in the war. The next one, December 1915, Phosgene, and the final one, July 1917, mustard. So we've got 4 gases: tear gas, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, mustard gas. TCPM. TC, Top Cat. PM, Prime Minister. Top Cat for Prime Minister. That might help you to remember it. Now, what did these gases do? Chlorine, it is deadly. It can suffocate you. Used in the Second Battle of Ypres. Okay, 168 tons of it were used on the first day. But it depends on the wind. If the wind changes, it blows the gas back to the army that had sent the gas. So it wasn't necessarily always very, very effective. But mustard gas, not a very nice gas. Chlorine that was. Next gas, phosgene. Again, causes suffocation. The thing about phosgene is there's not much smell. So therefore the soldiers wouldn't get much warning. The final gas, mustard gas. Blisters, burning on the skin, infection. It clings to other parts of the uniform. It stayed in the shell holes, and it was still killing maybe weeks after it was first used. So the gas was another type of weapon which led to those types of wounds. Early in the war, of course, they didn't have enough gas masks. So remember I said they'd have to do a wee on a handkerchief and use that. Later on they got a supply of gas masks, not always hugely effective. So gas was a weapon which caused some terrible wounds, but it spread terror. That was really its biggest effect. The soldiers hated the idea of gas. There's some very, very famous photographs of all the soldiers lined up. They've obviously been blinded temporarily, and they've got their arm on the shoulder of the soldier in front, and then they are making their way back through the chain of evacuation, back to the dressing stations, or the casualty clearing stations, or the base hospitals. Gas, another weapon. The final thing I wish to talk about in this video, ladies and gentlemen, infection. Wound infection. Those of you who have studied the history of medicine, there was a doctor in World War I, Dr. Alexander Fleming. Why is he famous? Yep, 1928, the man who discovered penicillin. Why was he looking for penicillin? Because he'd seen so many soldiers die from infection in World War I. So there we see the link between the war and medicine. Now, the trenches have been dug in Belgium and France. Well, the land that they dug the trenches in, before the war, it was farmland. So it was full of fertilizer, manure. The soil had bacteria in it. The soldiers are living in the soil. Bullets, shells are exploding. The soil is going into the body. Infection. Problems. If you've gone over the top and you are wounded in no man's land, you could not immediately say, oh, allow me to go back and get some treatment. No, you'd have to wait for night time and then crawl back, or wait for the stretcher bearers to bring you back. So length of time for getting treatment was a problem. In that time, of course, the bacteria is spreading. One of the key diseases and injuries that were caused was sepsis, almost like poison, which could lead to death. Another one was gas gangrene. Now, gas gangrene is referring not to the gas that the soldiers sometimes used. No, it's referring to the bacteria in the soil. And it would cause a terrible smell. And the wounds, the soldiers' bodies would get all swollen and turn different colours. Whites, greens, blues, almost bubbling up on the surface of the skin. Gas gangrene was a terrible disease caused by the injury and the infection. What could the soldiers or the army do about it? What could the medics do? Well, they had some treatments. They devised an anti-tetanus serum, an injection. Carbolic acid was used. Carbolic acid. Where have we seen that before? History of medicine. Yes, Lister, 1860s. Here it is being used 50 years later in the war. Carbolic acid was used. Paraffin paste was given and placed on the skin, called BIP, B-I-P-P. And sadly, sometimes the only treatment which would keep the soldier alive would be amputation. 1918, World War I ended. We had to wait another 10 years for 1928 and penicillin. And we had to wait another 13 or 14 years for mass-produced penicillin, World War II. So there we see the wounds and the injuries caused by these new weapons. Machine gun, artillery, rifle, shrapnel, Mars. The gases, TCPM, tear gas, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, mustard gas. Top Cat Prime Minister. Hope it's been useful as ever, ladies and gentlemen. So, I've still got my Brody helmet on. So hopefully I'm safe. Speak to you soon with the next video. All the best now. See you later.